dinosaurs were not just enormous creatures that once walked the earth. They were the rulers of a lost world, a world more violent, more strange, and more powerful than most of us can imagine. For more than 160 million years, they dominated this planet in countless forms, from towering giants that shook the ground beneath them to swift predators built for speed, instinct, and survival. But the most fascinating thing about dinosaurs is not simply how big they were or how terrifying they looked. It is the fact that they rose, evolved, conquered nearly every environment on Earth, and then somehow lost everything. How did they become so successful? What was life really like in their world? And how did creatures so powerful disappear so completely that all we have left are bones, footprints, and fragments of stone? The story of dinosaurs is not just the story of monsters from the past. It is a story of evolution, domination, mystery, and extinction. And to understand it, we have to go back to a time when Earth belonged to giants. The animal I want to talk about tonight lived 66 to 69 million years ago in what is now Western North America. You already have an image of it in your mind. Almost everyone does. It is one of the most fixed images in the entire history of natural science. The massive skull, the tiny forelimbs, the thick column of tail balancing the forward lean of a body built around a jaw, scales, rows of teeth, power absolute and cold. You know roughly half the story. The other half is something stranger and something quieter and much more beautiful. The fossil was pulled from a shallow draw in eastern Montana in 1902 by a man named Barnum Brown, assistant curator at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Brown was one of those remarkable figures of early paleontology who seemed to have an instinct for the bone. He would go on to find more T-Rex specimens than anyone else in history, and the skeleton he uncovered from the Hell Creek Formation that year was approximately 34 fossilized bones of something no one had officially named or measured. Henry Fairfield Osborn, the museum's president, named it in 1905. Tyrannosaurus Rex, tyrant lizard the king, every syllable chosen for impact. The name itself was a kind of performance, and the animal was immediately understood as the apex of something, the terminal expression of predatory evolution, the largest meat-eating land animal that science had yet encountered, standing nearly 4 meters tall and stretching 12 meters from snout to tail. For the first half of the 20th century, it was reconstructed as a kind of scaled upright colossus, dragging its thick tail on the ground, moving like an enormous cold-blooded lizard in slow, deliberate steps. The image was everywhere, in children's encyclopedias, in museum dioramas with paint black glass eyes, in the popular imagination as the definitive monster of deep time. When a film franchise in 1993 placed a faithfully rendered version of this creature in front of a global audience, scaly, powerful, terrifyingly present in the rain, the image became fixed in a way that almost no other piece of natural history has ever been fixed. Most people who have never opened a science journal carry that version of T-Rex with them. And then, in 1996, a small fossil from the Liaoning province of northeastern China arrived in a scientific journal like a stone dropped into still water. The animal was called Sinosauropteryx prima, It was a small, lightly built carnivore, about the size and proportions of a chicken, and around its skeleton, the fossil matrix preserved a halo. A fine, filamentous halo of structures that were, without question, not scales. They were soft, branched, distributed across the back and tail in a way that could only be described, however cautiously at first, as feathers. The stone had been dropped. The water would not stop moving. To understand what that discovery eventually unlocked, you need to follow the Tyrannosaur family tree back toward its roots. T-Rex was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the last and largest expression of a lineage called Tyrannosauroidea, a group that had been diversifying for roughly 80 million years before T-Rex appeared. And the further back you go in that lineage, the more consistently you find feathers. In 2004, paleontologists in Liaoning province described a small tyrannosaur called DeLong paradoxus, a fox-sized early member of the Tyrannosaur family living approximately 130 million years ago, which preserved clear filamentous integumentary structures along its jaw and tail. Stage 1 proto-feathers, simple hollow shafts, the earliest known form more like the fine down of a newly hatched bird than the structured plumes of an adult, distributed across the body of something that was unmistakably part of T-Rex's family tree. Then came 2012, and the discovery that changed the scale of what was possible. 3 nearly complete skeletons were described from Liaoning, an adult and 2 smaller individuals. The adult measured 9 meters from snout to tail and weighed approximately 1,400 kilograms. The creature was named Eutyrannus huali, a compound of Mandarin and Latin that translates with elegant completeness as beautiful feathered tyrant. And it was exactly that. Preserved in the extraordinarily fine volcanic ash sediment of Liaoning, the only conditions fine enough to record structures as delicate as feathers were filamentous integumentary structures up to 20 centimeters long, distributed across the neck and upper arm of the smallest specimens, near the pelvis and foot of the adult. Long, filamentous, unmistakable. Eutyrannus huali was, at the time of its description, the largest feathered animal known to science, 40 times heavier than the previous record holder, about the weight of a large horse, covered in what researchers described as resembling the fuzzy down of a baby chick. Simple, insulating filaments, rather than the structured veined feathers of a modern bird. The climate of its environment averaged approximately 10 degrees Celsius annually. These feathers were almost certainly thermal insulation, a winter coat on a creature the size of an elephant, stalking a cold early Cretaceous landscape. What does this mean for T-Rex itself? Here, the science requires some care. And care, I think, makes the story more interesting, not less. Fossil skin impressions from Tyrannosaurus rex, taken from the neck, the abdomen, and the tail, show small polygonal scales. A 2017 study published in Biology Letters confirmed that the skin of large tyrannosaurids, including T-Rex, was predominantly scaly on the body regions we have evidence for. This is what the fossils tell us. But, and this is the important distinction, the fossil record cannot tell us about regions that never preserved. Areas of soft tissue around the head, along the upper back and flanks, where feathery structures, if they existed, would have been the least likely to survive the long process of fossilization. As researcher Steve Broussat of the University of Edinburgh noted, the absence of feathers in the fossil record does not prove their absence in life. And there is a further reasonable inference, labeled here as exactly that, an inference, not a confirmed fact, that juvenile T-Rex may have been downy. Many large modern birds, including ostriches and emus, hatch covered in fine, downy filaments that are later replaced by adult plumage. If the same developmental pattern applied in the tyrannosaur lineage, young T-Rex may have been considerably softer than the adult. A small feathered tyrant before it became something else. Now we come to the piece of evidence that, of everything in this story, I find most quietly extraordinary. In 2008, a team of researchers at Harvard University published findings in the journal Science that represented something genuinely unprecedented. The molecular analysis of a fragment of protein recovered from a 68-million-year-old T-Rex femur. The bone had been discovered in 2003 by paleontologist John Horner in Montana, and in 2005, researcher Mary Schweitzer of North Carolina State University had identified preserved soft tissue within it. Her colleague, John Asara, used mass spectrometry, a technique capable of sequencing minute quantities of protein, to extract and read 6 short collagen peptides, 89 amino acids in total. Those 89 amino acids placed T-Rex with statistical confidence in a phylogenetic tree, closest to the living animal called a chicken. Second closest, an ostrich, not a crocodile, not a lizard, not any of the reptilian relatives one might expect from the old image of a scaly monster. A chicken and an ostrich, modern birds, the living representatives of the only dinosaur lineage that survived the asteroid impact 66 million years ago, carrying in their proteins the echo of an animal that ruled the late Cretaceous. This is not a coincidence. It is a relationship. A taxonomic classification called Tyrannoraptora formally defines a clade containing Tyrannosaurus rex, the house sparrow, their last common ancestor, and all descendants. T-Rex and the house sparrow belong to the same named evolutionary group. They share a common ancestor. The sparrow on the fence outside your window, regarding the morning with its small, perfect eye, is carrying in its bones and its feathers and its hollow-walled skeleton the deep history of something you would not want to meet in person. There are approximately 10,000 species of bird alive on Earth today. They are, in the strict biological sense, dinosaurs. The only members of the dinosaur lineage that made it through the end Cretaceous extinction event intact, and then diversified with an explosive energy that produced everything from the wandering albatross to the Anna's hummingbird, which weighs 3 grams and beats its wings 40 to 50 times per second. Every one of them is a living theropod. Every one of them carries feathers that are the direct evolutionary descendants of the proto-feathers worn by Yutyrannus in its cold Cretaceous forest 125 million years ago. The tyrant did not end, it transformed. The lineage that produced T-Rex did not disappear when the asteroid came. It had already, in smaller and more agile and more thoroughly feathered relatives, invented the wing. It had already invented the hollow bone, the wishbone, The three-toed grasping foot, the warm metabolism that could power sustained flight. When the giants fell, the small ones rose, and what rose was feathered. The monster became the morning birds. The scales gave way over millions of years of patient change to something that could climb into the air and fill every ecological niche in the sky. Evolution's artistry, working over a timescale so long it becomes almost abstract, arrived at the feather not as decoration, but as the thing that let the lineage continue after everything else was gone. The room is very quiet now. Somewhere outside, even at this hour, there may be the sound of something in a tree, a shift of wings, the very faint percussion of a small body adjusting its position in the dark. If you listen closely enough, that sound carries something like 160 million years of history in it. A lineage that began long before T-Rex, ran through T-Rex, and continued, feathered, warm, improbably alive, past the end of everything T-Rex knew. That kind of time is restful to contemplate if you let it be. Your own life, your own day, the weight of all its small concerns, all of it sits inside a moment so brief in the scale of that history that it barely registers. And yet, here you are, warm, safe, breathing slowly. But that was only one part of a much larger story. The world of the dinosaurs was never still for long. Continents drifted apart, climates shifted, and entire ecosystems rose and fell over millions of years. With every change, new species emerged, old ones disappeared, and the balance of power began to shift. And as one era slowly came to an end, another began, bringing with it new dangers, new landscapes, and creatures even more extraordinary than before. Take a breath that goes all the way to the low part of your chest, the slow kind, the kind that takes a moment, and let it out even more slowly until there is nothing left to release. Tonight, I want to take you to a different kind of quiet, older and wider and warm in the way that a late Cretaceous floodplain is warm. Heat coming up from the ground and the broad fronds of palms making their slow adjustments in a wind that has been blowing across the same landscape for 1,000,000 years. The rivers here run through soft, dark soil. The sky at the end of the day goes deep amber before it goes dark. And in the middle of all of that, something is grazing, unhurried, moving through the low vegetation with the patience of an animal that has all evening. You think you know what it is, what it looks like, what it was. By the end of tonight, you may know something closer to the truth. The first pieces of it came out of the ground in Colorado in 1887, excavated by a paleontologist named John Bell Hatcher. What he found were horn cores, large, weathered, and entirely without context. Hatcher sent them to Othniel Charles Marsh in New Haven, who looked at the size of them and wrote back that they were probably from a large and unusual bison. An enormous, horned mammal from recent times, not a dinosaur. He was wrong in a way that would not be corrected for another 2 years. When more material came in and the skull's true nature became clear, Marsh named it in 1889. Triceratops horridus, three-horned face, rough or fearsome. The name was a verdict, and the verdict stuck. By the early decades of the 20th century, Triceratops had been assembled in the great museum halls of natural history, in New York, in Washington, and London, in postures that confirmed everything the name implied. A low, wide body braced against the world, a skull that constituted, in some reconstructions, nearly 1/3 of the animal's total body length. 2 long brow horns above the eyes, each over a meter long in an adult, pointing forward and slightly upward in the orientation of something prepared to use them. And behind the horns, that enormous bony shield, the frill, sweeping back from the skull like the raised collar of an animal announcing itself. Generations of children pressed their faces to those glass cases and understood immediately and completely what they were looking at: a tank. The most heavily armed herbivore in the history of the world evolved to meet the most dangerous predator that ever walked the North American continent. The diorama version of Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus locked in combat became one of the most reproduced images in natural history. Every children's encyclopedia, every museum gift shop, every classroom poster. 2 titans in a Cretaceous storm. It is a powerful image. It is also, most researchers now believe, only a fraction of the actual story. Because as the skull material accumulated, and Triceratops skulls accumulated faster than almost any other large dinosaur, Barnum Brown alone reporting over 500 skulls observed in Montana's Hell Creek Formation, the question that researchers kept returning to was this: if those horns were purely weapons, purely defensive, why were they so extraordinarily, extravagantly, specifically elaborate? Why did they change shape so dramatically from one individual to the next? Why did they grow differently in juveniles and adults, reversing their curve at a particular stage of development in a way that no purely functional weapon would need to do? Defense does not require theater, but theater in nature almost always means an audience. Look closely at a Triceratops skull. Closely enough to see the surface of the bone rather than the shape of the hole, and you will notice something that the diorama version never showed you. The bone is not smooth. It is marked across almost its entire surface with a dense network of grooves and channels. These are the osteological traces of blood vessels, the physical record preserved for 68 million years of a living circulatory system that ran not just through the interior of the bone, but across the frill's outer surface, threading through the flat plane of that broad, facing structure like rivers through a floodplain. The Britannica description of Triceratops notes that most of the skull was covered in these indentations, and draws a direct comparison to the vascular patterning found under the keratinous beaks of modern birds. Structures that, in living animals, are known to flush with blood in response to temperature change, social arousal, and courtship. The frill of Triceratops, in other words, was not a static shield. It was a living surface, a flat expanse of highly vascularized bone covered in whatever soft tissue overlay it in life. Tissue that, like the crest of a modern iguana or the wattle of a bird, almost certainly changed color or warmth in response to the animal's internal state. The frill's edges were lined with small bony projections called epoccipitals, up to 26 of them on a fully grown adult, their shape varying between individuals in ways that would have made each animal visually distinct at a distance across a herd. Not a uniform weapon, an individual face. In 2018, a study led by Andrew Knapp of Queen Mary University of London, published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B, analyzed 350 defined characteristics across multiple ceratopsian genera, searching for the evolutionary driver behind their elaborate ornamentation. The team tested 3 competing hypotheses: predator defense, species recognition, and sexual selection. They found no support for species recognition as the primary driver. No evidence that ceratopsians in the same geographic area evolved more divergent ornaments than those living separately, which is what the species recognition hypothesis would predict. What they found instead was a pattern consistent with sexual selection. Ornaments showing rapid evolution, characteristic developmental changes tied to maturity, and the kind of exaggeration that biology reserves for traits whose purpose is to be noticed. Knapp compared it directly to peacock tail feathers, structures that cost the animal something, that carried genuine information about the health and genetic quality of the individual displaying them, and that are assessed carefully by those who need to choose. Both male and female triceratops, the study noted, appear to have had similarly developed horns and frills. An observation that suggests the display was not purely about male competition, but about recognition, communication, and the mutual advertisement of suitability across the whole social group. The frill was not a shield, it was a signal, and it was sending that signal continuously to every triceratops within eyeshot in a living visual language that 68 million years of fossilization has almost entirely silenced. Now we can walk toward the animal in the floodplain and see it properly. The beak at the front of the mouth is a deep, curved structure, shaped precisely for grasping and pulling, evolved over the tens of millions of years of ceratopsian history for one specific purpose: cropping the low, tough vegetation of a late Cretaceous floodplain. Cycads, ferns, the broad-leaved palms that grew in dense stands along the river margins. Triceratops was the dominant herbivore of its time and place. Paleontologist Robert Bakker estimated in 1986 that it comprised around 5/6 of the large dinosaur fauna in the last stage of the Cretaceous. The landscape, in other words, was full of them, moving through the vegetation, working methodically through the low-growing plants, their dental batteries, stacked columns of teeth that replaced themselves continuously as each tooth wore down, shearing tough plant matter with steady, patient repetition. Fossilized footprints from Triceratops and related ceratopsids show an animal that did not range widely. It stayed near water. It grazed the same floodplains and river margins that it knew. Its front limbs were held in an intermediate stance, not fully sprawling, not fully upright. Something between the two, comparable to the posture of a modern rhinoceros moving at a slow walk. The elbows slightly bowed outward, the massive head carried low and steady. And that head changed across the animal's lifetime in ways that a 2006 study by John Horner and Mark Goodwin of the Museum of the Rockies traced in careful detail. The smallest Triceratops skulls, juveniles recently hatched, have small straight brow horns. Slightly larger juveniles show backward curving brow horns and triangular occipitals along the frill edge. As the animal matured toward adulthood, those brow horns reversed direction, curving forward and outward into the long, sweeping form of the adult. The occipitals along the frill edge flattened and spread. The whole skull changed shape, year by year, in a way that broadcast the animal's age and status to every other triceratops it met. A young animal, approaching a group, its backward curving horns reading as juvenile to any adult in the vicinity. The adults, frills perhaps, subtly flushed with the blood moving through those surface channels, reading the newcomer and responding in kind. Posture, proximity, the angle at which a head was held, all of it communicating across the herd in a language made entirely from anatomy, from the structures we once read only as weapons and shields. The evening is long in the late Cretaceous, and there is no urgency in it. The horizon holds the last warmth longer than it needs to, as if the day is reluctant to release what it has built. And now, the light is finally failing over the floodplain, and the herd moves slowly through the last amber warmth of the evening. Their frills catch the low light, each one distinct, each one a face. Their beaks work through the low vegetation. The river beside them runs steadily through the dark soil. Nothing is hurrying, nothing is bracing. They are simply here in the warm evening together. The weapon became the signal. The tank became the grazer. And the signal was not aggression, but recognition. The fundamental, ancient need to be seen, to be known, to communicate across the distance between one living body and another. You know something about that, whatever hour it is as you listen to this. The need to be received for what you are, to have someone look at you and understand, without explanation, what they are seeing. Let the evening in the floodplain stay with you a little. The amber light on the frills, the slow, steady sound of grazing, the herd moving through the warm dark, talking to each other in colors we can no longer see. And let yourself go quiet now, unhurried, like the grazer in the last light, like something that has nothing left to prove tonight. Yet this was far from the end of their story. What followed would be even more intense, more unpredictable, and far more dangerous. As the planet changed, so did the animals that ruled it, forced to adapt to harsher conditions, stronger rivals, and an increasingly unforgiving world. Survival was never guaranteed, even for the most powerful creatures to ever walk the earth. And in the age that followed, only the strongest, fastest, and most adaptable would continue to reign. Whatever was pressing before, the weight of it, the forward lean of it, the sense that there was always one more thing, it has released, the way a breath releases when you finally stop trying to hold it in the right shape. And what you're left with is this: the dark, the quiet, and the particular stillness of a late hour that belongs completely to you. Let yourself settle into it. Your shoulders, if they've been carrying something up near your ears all day, can come down now. Your hands can open. The space between your eyes, where the day sometimes leaves a crease, can soften. Take a slow breath, the kind that goes all the way down, the kind you don't usually have time for. Let the out-breath go even more slowly until there's nothing left to release. I want to take you somewhere tonight that is older than sleep itself, older than dreams as we know them. A warm floodplain 75 million years ago, where the air carries more moisture than a summer storm, and the light at the end of the day turns everything amber, and then slowly, slowly gold. Conifers rise in tall columns along the water's edge. Ferns and the first flowering plants grow dense in the lower brush, their leaves catching and holding the last warmth of the evening. And moving through all of it, unhurried and fast, a herd of animals with their crests lifted to the sky. They are about to make a sound the earth had never heard before, and somewhere in that sound, low and warm and older than anything we have ever recorded, is the first lullaby. The first evidence of this animal came out of the ground in 1920 along the Red Deer River in Alberta, Canada, where a field party from the University of Toronto discovered a skull and a partial skeleton in the late Cretaceous rock of the Dinosaur Park Formation. Paleontologist William Parks named the specimen in 1922 Parasaurolophus walkeri in honor of Sir Byron Edmund Walker, chairman of the Royal Ontario Museum's Board of Trustees. The name itself means beside crested lizard, a reference to a related animal, Saurolophus, that the new specimen resembled but surpassed in the sheer ambition of its anatomy. The crest is what stops you. It is the first thing you notice, and the longer you look at it, the less you understand how something so architecturally committed grew out of skull. In the largest known adults, belonging to the species Parasaurolophus tubicin, found in New Mexico, the crest extends backward from the skull for up to 1.8 meters. A hollow bony tube formed entirely from the elongated nasal bones, sweeping upward and curving back in a long, graceful arc above the animal's head. Not a horn for fighting, not a snorkel for diving. A tube, hollow along its entire length, connecting the nostrils at the front of the face to the back of the skull, and folding back again, creating a set of paired passages that run the full length of the crest and return. Inside that crest, the air passages do not simply continue straight. They loop, they divide and rejoin. They create a labyrinth of chambers and channels that, once the hollow interior was properly imaged for the first time, astonished the researchers who looked at it not because of its complexity alone, but because of what that complexity implied. A structure this elaborate, built at this cost to the animal's size and weight and center of gravity, was not built for nothing. It was built for sound. When air moves through a long, hollow tube, it vibrates. The length and shape of the tube determines the frequency of those vibrations, which is why a trombone produces a different note than a flute, why a large organ pipe sounds so different from a small one. The Parasaurolophus crest was, in the most literal biological sense, a wind instrument, a living, bone-built, warm-blooded instrument that grew with the animal across its entire life, changing in length and shape, and therefore in pitch as the years passed, producing a voice that was, researchers now believe, as individual as a face. In August 1995, a particularly well-preserved Parasaurolophus skull was excavated from public land near Farmington in northwestern New Mexico. The crest was nearly complete, lacking only the segment below the eyes, and it was approximately 1.4 meters long. Paleontologist Tom Williamson of the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science recognized immediately that this specimen offered something previous finds had not: enough intact internal structure to properly study the air passages. The skull was taken to St. Joseph Medical Center in Albuquerque, where it was CT scanned in approximately 350 cross-sections taken at 3-millimeter intervals. Those cross-sections were then loaded into the computers of Sandia National Laboratories. where computer scientist Carl Diegert used advanced three-dimensional modeling software, the same kind used for complex engineering simulations, to reconstruct the interior passages without cutting into the fossil itself. Once the size and shape of the air tubes were precisely mapped, the software could simulate what happened when air moved through them. What came out of that computer in 1997 was a sound, low, resonant, variable in pitch as the virtual airflow changed speed. A rumble that researchers described as somewhere between a trombone and a tuba, capable of shifting pitch across a limited range. Diegert and Williamson had, for the first time in approximately 66 million years, given the Parasaurolophus its voice. The acoustic analysis placed the crest's primary resonant frequencies in a range estimated between 30 and 200 hertz. For comparison, the lowest note on a standard tuba sits around 29 hertz. The lowest note a human voice can comfortably produce is around 80 hertz. The midpoint of the Parasaurolophus frequency range sits in the register you feel as much as hear, the kind of low, warm vibration that seems to arrive not through the ears, but through the chest, the kind that large concert organs produce when a deep pedal note is held and the sound becomes physical rather than merely auditory. Paleontologist David Weiss-Hampel, who studied the crest from an acoustic perspective before the CT work was possible, had already proposed that it functioned as a resonating chamber capable of long-distance communication, comparing its internal anatomy to a crumhorn, a Renaissance woodwind instrument whose cylindrical bore and narrow resonating chamber produce a buzzing, reedy tone in the mid to low frequency range. He went further. He built a physical model from PVC pipe and blew air through it. The results sounded, he noted, something like a tuba. In November 2024, Hongjun Lin of New York University presented results at the 187th meeting of the Acoustical Society of America that extended this work into new precision. Lin had built a physical model of the Parasaurolophus crest using a set of tubes, a device the researcher nicknamed the Linophone, at a scale of 1 to 1.5 relative to an adult Parasaurolophus. The model was suspended by cotton threads, excited by a small speaker, and measured with a microphone. The frequency peaks came in at 581 hertz, 827 hertz, and 1056 hertz in the scaled model, and because the Linophone was built at 1.5 times scale, a full-sized adult crest would have produced an even lower spectrum. Lin's results aligned with all previous acoustic research, confirming that the crest was a resonating structure and predicting a sound lower and richer than the model itself produced. Each individual animal, with its slightly different crest length and slightly different passage geometry, would have had its own voice. Williamson observed that each Parasaurolophus probably had a voice distinctive enough to be identified not only from other dinosaurs, but from other individuals within its own herd. Young animals, with their shorter, still developing crests, produced higher frequency sounds that carry shorter distances, close-range contact calls suited to proximity within the group. Adults produced the deep, carrying resonance that could move across the full width of a late Cretaceous floodplain, reaching other herds across the water. Now we return to the evening. The late Cretaceous of New Mexico and Alberta was not the arid landscape those regions hold today. The western interior seaway, a warm, shallow inland sea that divided North America into two land masses for much of the Cretaceous, ran somewhere near the horizon. The land bordering it was low and wet. Swampy floodplains, silted lowlands, river channels braiding through dense vegetation. Conifers rose in tall columns above a lower story of tree ferns and cycads, and in the newest corners of the ecosystem, the first flowering angiosperms, broad-leafed and pale-flowered, still finding their place in a world that had been green in other ways for 100 million years before them. The climate was warm without frost, humid with distinct wet and dry seasons. The air in the late afternoon carried the smell of wet soil and sun-warmed resin, and the particular sweetness of vegetation growing in abundance along water. A herd of Parasaurolophus moves through this landscape as the light shifts. They are large, up to 9.5 meters long in the adults, weighing 2.5 tons or more, moving between bipedal and quadrupedal gaits depending on speed and terrain. Their duck-billed beaks pulling ferns and conifer needles and the broad leaves of angiosperms from the low vegetation. They are not rushing. The day has been long and the foraging has been good, and now the evening is arriving, and with it the gradual settling that large herd animals do at dusk. And then one of them calls. It is not a sharp sound. It is not the staccato alarm of a threatened animal or the aggressive display of a male advertising itself in the height of mating season. It is a long, low, resonant tone that begins somewhere deep in the animal's chest, rises through the nasal passages, enters the hollow labyrinth of the crest, and emerges changed, amplified, shaped by bone into something that carries far and decays slowly. It sits in the lower end of that 30 to 200 hertz range, a frequency that, at its lowest, would not have been heard by other Parasaurolophus as a distinct sound, but would have been felt. A vibration moving through the ground, through the water, through the dense warm air. A physical thing, a presence as much as a signal. Another animal answers, a different pitch. The crest slightly shorter, the passages slightly narrower, the voice its own, and another, the sounds layering across each other in the amber evening, rising and falling, the herd's individual voices weaving into something collective. What those calls said, in the evolutionary sense, was practical. The herd is here. The evening is known. There is no alarm. But what they produced across the floodplain in the humid, warm air of the late Cretaceous afternoon was something that preceded every lullaby ever sung by any human voice by roughly 75 million years. A low, resonant sound, held and passed between living things, the function of which was, at its most fundamental, to say that all is well. Researchers note that the lowest frequencies in the Parasaurolophus range sit in the infrasound register, which is below the threshold of conscious human hearing, but not below the threshold of physical sensation. If you had been standing on that floodplain in the warm evening, you would not have heard those lowest tones. You would have felt them, moving through the ground under your feet, through the air against your skin, through the cavity of your chest. A slow, steady pulse, warm and enormous, and entirely unthreatening. That sensation is, perhaps, the oldest sleep sound the earth ever made. It is very quiet now, whatever distance exists between that warm Cretaceous floodplain and this room, this hour, this moment, it collapses a little when you let it. The low register, the held tone, the sound that does not ask anything of the body except to receive it. Let your breathing find that frequency, long, slow, settled. The out-breath a little longer than the in-breath, the way a resonant tone decays, gradually, without abruptness, until it simply is no longer there and something quieter has taken its place. The first lullaby is still out there if you listen for it. It is in the low register of every sound the night makes when it means to be gentle. But to truly understand the age of the dinosaurs, we have to look beyond a single moment and see the bigger picture. Their history was not one simple unbroken reign, but a vast and changing saga shaped by time, environment, and evolution. Each period reveals a different world with new challenges, new predators, and new struggles for survival. And as we move forward through that history, the story becomes not only bigger in scale, but deeper, stranger, and far more fascinating than it first appears. The room has gone fully dark now, and the night outside has settled into itself. There is no more transition happening, no liminal slipping from day into evening. It is simply night, committed and complete, and you are in the middle of it, which is exactly where you're supposed to be. Let your breathing find its slow pace, not a performed slowness, not a forced calm, just the natural fall of a body that has finally been given permission to stop. Your shoulders, if they've been anywhere near your ears tonight, can come down. The back of your neck can unwind 1 degree at a time. Your hands can open, palms upward, releasing whatever they've been holding since morning. There is a story I want to tell you tonight that spans 66 million years. It begins with fire and ends with feathers. It moves from the most catastrophic single event in the history of complex life on this planet to the small, improbable, extraordinary creatures that inherited everything. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the chemistry of a bone pulled from a Montana hillside, is one of the most quietly stunning pieces of scientific evidence ever produced. But before the fire, the world. Before the ending, the morning when everything was still alive. Let yourself go there now. A forest, ancient and enormous, the canopy so high and dense that the light arriving at the ground is soft and filtered and green. The air is warm and humid. Something is moving through it, unhurried and vast, on its last morn before the world it knew was taken away. The evidence is in the rock. Fossilized dinosaur remains found within approximately 340,000 years of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the geological line that marks the end of the dinosaur age, show a world that was thriving, not declining. Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, and Edmontosaurus were present and varied across western North America. In what is now New Mexico, the enormous long-necked Alamosaurus, which could exceed 24 meters in length and weigh more than 30 tons, was still moving across the landscape. The non-avian dinosaurs, whatever stresses they had faced in the preceding millions of years, were alive and present and occupying their world up to the very edge of the event that ended them. The event itself arrived from space at around 66 million years ago, during what geologists now believe was the northern hemisphere's spring. An asteroid approximately 10 kilometers wide, roughly the height of Mount Everest, turned sideways, struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico at a speed estimated at around 20 kilometers per second. The energy released was on order of billions of times greater than any nuclear weapon ever detonated. The rock vaporized. The sea floor beneath the impact point was thrown outward and upward. Debris was ejected into the upper atmosphere and beyond, and as it re-entered, the friction of re-entry heated the air across the planet's surface to temperatures compared by researchers to those inside an oven. Forest fires ignited across continents. The thermal pulse arrived within hours of impact on every landmass simultaneously. Then came the darkness. Soot, ash, and pulverized rock filled the upper atmosphere. Sunlight, the engine of every food chain on Earth through photosynthesis, could no longer reach the ground. Temperatures fell. Plants stopped growing. The bottom of the food chain, which everything else depended upon, quietly collapsed. Animals that required large quantities of food, which, in the warm-blooded, fast-metabolizing world of the late Cretaceous, meant most of the large dinosaurs, began to starve. More than 75% of all species known from the end of the Cretaceous did not survive into the Paleogene period that followed. The silence after that must have been extraordinary. A world that had been moving and sounding and eating and being eaten for 165 million years, suddenly very, very still. But not completely, not everywhere. In the deep soil and the seed caches and the crevices of surviving ground cover, something small was waiting. To understand who survived, you need to understand what the post-impact world actually required of any animal trying to live in it. The forests were gone or severely reduced. The canopy that had defined the ecological architecture of so much of the Mesozoic had been burned or stripped bare, or simply no longer received enough light to sustain itself. This was not merely a loss of habitat. It was the removal of a structural feature that entire groups of animals had built their lives around. A 2018 study, published in Current Biology, led by paleontologist Daniel Field of the University of Bath, examined the ecological habits of modern birds and worked backward through the evolutionary record to determine what the ancestors of today's birds were doing when the asteroid hit. The conclusion was stark. The bird lineages that survived were almost certainly ground-dwelling. The ones that lived in trees, including the enantiornithines, the opposite birds, which were the most diverse and numerous bird group in the Cretaceous, represented by thousands of species across every continent, vanished almost entirely with the trees they lived in. The survivors were small, very small. A Cornell University study published in 2017 found that the avian lineages making it through the extinction may have been approximately 80% smaller than their pre-impact counterparts, a phenomenon called the Lilliput effect, which has been documented in multiple groups across multiple mass extinction events. Small bodies need less food. In a world where food was scarce and would remain scarce for years, being small was not a disadvantage. It was the specific advantage. And the surviving birds had beaks, toothless, relatively simple beaks, the kind built for picking up and cracking seeds. Seeds have an extraordinary property. They can remain viable in soil for years, even decades, while green plants struggled and died in the post-impact darkness. The seeds those plants had produced before the event were still there, dormant in the ground, waiting for light to return. A bird capable of finding and processing those seeds had a food source that outlasted the catastrophe itself. Field and his colleagues concluded that as few as 5 major ancestral bird lineages made it through the KPG boundary intact. 5 lineages out of an entire world of avian diversity that had flourished for 80 million years. From those 5, in the decades and centuries that followed, as forests slowly recovered and ecological niches opened one by one, came the explosion. Nearly 11,000 species of bird alive today, every swift and albatross and kingfisher and penguin and hummingbird, descending from a handful of small ground-dwelling seed-eating survivors who held on in the darkness while the rest of the Mesozoic world went quiet. Now we come to the piece of this story that I have been holding in reserve because it requires its own stillness to properly receive. In 2003, paleontologist John Horner of the Museum of the Rockies excavated a T-Rex femur from the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. In 2005, researcher Mary Schweitzer of North Carolina State University, examining the bone, found something inside it that should not have been there. Evidence of preserved soft tissue. Original biological material, surviving inside fossilized bone after 68 million years. The assumption, until that point, had been that fossilization was a complete replacement process, that every molecule of original biology was eventually substituted by mineral, that nothing organic could survive for more than 1 million years at most. Schweitzer's discovery rewrote that assumption. John Asara, a specialist in mass spectrometry at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, spent approximately 18 months using techniques developed for sequencing minute protein fragments from human tumors to extract and read what was preserved in that bone. What he found were 7 peptides of collagen, the structural protein that forms the scaffolding of bone, one of the most conserved proteins in vertebrate biology. 7 fragments, 89 amino acids in total, almost nothing by the standards of modern genomics, and yet enough. When those 89 amino acids were run through molecular comparison algorithms against the proteins of 21 modern species, the result placed T-Rex not among the lizards or the crocodilians, but among the birds. Specifically, it grouped T-Rex closest to chickens and ostriches more closely than to any other organism in the study. John Asara stated the finding plainly. T-Rex grouped with birds, ostrich and chicken, better than any other organism they studied. The 2008 paper in Science represented the first time molecular data had ever been used to place a non-avian dinosaur in a phylogenetic tree. The result confirmed and extended what the fossil record had long suggested, that the theropod dinosaur lineage and the bird lineage are not merely related by skeletal resemblance. They are related at the level of the protein, at the level of the molecule, at the deepest measurable biological level available to science. Now consider a hummingbird. An Anna's hummingbird weighs approximately 3 grams. It beats its wings between 40 and 80 times per second, depending on the maneuver, a speed that requires a heart rate of up to 1,200 beats per minute during hovering flight. Its bones are hollow. It has a wishbone. It carries feathers whose developmental pathway is governed by the same genetic toolkit, involving BMP signaling in the sonic hedgehog pathway that controlled scale and early integumentary development in theropod dinosaurs. It is, in the formal biological classification, a living dinosaur, a member of OVS, which is itself a subgroup of Theropoda, which is itself a group of Saurischia, which is a group of Dinosauria. The protein in its bones carries the molecular echo of a lineage that T-Rex belonged to. Not metaphorically, not as a piece of poetic shorthand. In the collagen of its hollow, delicate, impossibly light skeleton, the same conserved sequences that Asara read from that 68-million-year-old femur in Montana are present and functioning, doing the same structural work they did for an animal 12 meters long and 6 tons heavy in a world that no longer exists. The great tyrant did not end. It became, over 66 million years of patient, relentless, improbable change, something that weighs 3 grams and can hover motionless in the air beside a flower. The line did not break. It narrowed to almost nothing in the darkness after the impact, and then it opened again into something almost inconceivably various. Every wing in the sky, every song at dawn, every migration route crossing the hemisphere, all of it running forward from those 5 small surviving lineages across all the time between then and now. If that thought can rest in you tonight, let it. The length of that journey, the number of small, ground-sleeping, seed-eating survivors who kept the lineage alive through the darkness, the extraordinary patience of time working without aim or agenda, arriving at the hummingbird by way of the tyrant. You are at the end of your own long day. Whatever it cost you, whatever you carried, whatever you held together, whatever quiet endurance the hours required, you made it to this stillness. And now the room is dark and the night is settled, and the only thing left to do is the easiest thing. Let your eyes close and your breathing slow and follow the dark down into sleep. The great return is always the same journey, out of the fire and into the quiet and into the morning. And still, this was only the beginning of a much greater journey. The age of the dinosaurs was not defined by a single species or a single moment, but by millions of years of transformation, conflict, and survival. As the earth continued to change, so too did the creatures that lived upon it, each new era giving rise to different rulers, different threats, and entirely different worlds. To move forward in this story is to step into another chapter of a planet in constant motion, where dominance was never permanent, and where every age brought something even more remarkable than the one before. Something is settling in the room. Not a dramatic change, nothing you could point to and name exactly. Just the gradual withdrawal of the day's forward lean. The sense that there is always something next, always something required, always somewhere to be. Drawing back now, the way a tide does, quietly and without announcement, until what remains is simply this: the dark, the warmth, the particular silence of a late hour that has given itself over completely to rest. Let your body receive that. It already knows what to do when the pressure lifts, if you give it permission. Your hands can open. The muscles across your shoulders, which have been doing work you may not have noticed, can finally release. The space behind your eyes where the brightness of the day leaves its residue, can go soft. Take a breath that is in no hurry. Just let the chest rise, slowly, all the way, and then let it fall, slower still, until there is nothing left to release and your body is simply here, receiving what the night has to offer. I want to take you to a landscape tonight that existed long before any human being drew breath. A wide, warm floodplain cut through by slow rivers, bordered on all sides by stands of conifers rising higher than any building in the world you know. The air is warm and heavy and smells of wet soil and resin and the ancient sweetness of plant matter in abundance, and something is moving through it, very slowly, something so large that the word large barely reaches the edge of what is required. The animal that holds the best claim to the title of largest land creature ever to have lived on Earth is called Argentinosaurus, and it was discovered by accident. In 1987, a farmer working land near the city of Plaza Huincul in Argentina's Neuquén province encountered a bone so large he assumed it was a piece of petrified wood. It was not until paleontologist Jose Bonaparte led a scientific excavation in 1989 that the bone, along with several enormous back vertebrae and parts of a sacrum, was identified as belonging to something entirely new. The formal scientific description came in 1993, and the name that emerged was as plain and complete as the discovery warranted: Argentinosaurus, the Argentine lizard. The size estimates that followed have been, by the nature of very incomplete fossil material, subject to revision, but the most rigorous volumetric analysis, conducted by independent paleontologist Gregory Paul and published in 2019, placed Argentinosaurus at between 30 and 35 meters in length and between 65 and 75 tons in body mass. For context, the African elephant, the largest land animal alive today, weighs between 4 and 6 tons. Argentinosaurus, by the conservative estimate, weighed more than 11 of them standing together. In 2013, a team led by William Sellers of the University of Manchester used computer simulation and machine learning to study how such a body could move. The algorithms modeled a complete skeletal reconstruction of Argentinosaurus and searched for the combination of movements that minimized energy requirements. The gait that emerged was something called a pace, the forelimb and hind limb on the same side of the body moving forward together rather than in the alternating diagonal pattern of a walk. The top speed reached by the model was just over 2 meters per second, or approximately 7.2 kilometers per hour, a brisk human walk on a 70-ton body. The Sellers team stated explicitly that with its size, Argentinosaurus had reached a functional limit. The bones and joints and muscles of a terrestrial vertebrate can only bear so much load before the structure fails. Any larger, the researchers noted, and the animal would have required a fundamentally different body plan. Argentinosaurus was, in the most literal engineering sense, the largest thing that the physics of bone and tendon on dry land would allow, and it was moving at 7 kilometers per hour. Each footfall of that body on the ground was the transfer of an extraordinary mass into the earth through a foot built like the broad spreading base of a column, 5-toed, thick, designed to distribute weight across as wide a surface as possible. The ground received that weight. It had no choice. The floodplain soils of the Cretaceous, soft with moisture, would have held the impression of each step for some time after the animal had passed. Here is a part of the story that I find quietly astonishing, and that will change how you picture the animal moving through that landscape. It was mostly empty. Sauropod dinosaurs, the entire group, from the earliest Triassic ancestors to the last titanosaurs of the late Cretaceous, had evolved a skeletal system that shared one of its most defining features with modern birds: pneumaticity, the hollow bone. In the cervical vertebrae of most sauropods, the bone was not solid. It was permeated by an interconnected system of air-filled cavities and diverticula, extensions of the respiratory air sac system that invaded the bone itself, removing dense tissue and replacing it with empty chambers separated by thin, bony struts and walls. Research published in the journal Royal Society Open Science quantified the effect. In adult sauropods, the cervical vertebrae were approximately 60% air by volume. In Sauroposeidon, one of the tallest known sauropods, CT imaging of the neck vertebrae found air spaces occupying up to 79% of the total vertebral volume. The largest bones in the largest animals that ever walked on land were structurally mostly nothing. This is not merely an interesting detail. It is the reason the neck was possible at all. Sauropods in the most derived groups had up to 19 cervical vertebrae, nearly 3 times the 7 that almost every mammal on Earth, from a shrew to a giraffe, possesses without exception. Each of those vertebrae was extraordinarily elongated, and because each one was structured like a thin-walled chamber rather than a dense mass of bone, the neck that resulted was far lighter than its dimensions suggested. The American Museum of Natural History notes that sauropod necks stretched up to nearly 9 meters in some species, and because the head at the end was evolved to be very small and simple, a stripped-down food-gathering tool rather than a heavily brained and muscled structure, the neck could reach that length without the animal toppling forward. Each vertebra joined the next in a ball and socket arrangement, the posterior face of one forming a shallow cup, the anterior face of the next forming a rounded condyle, allowing the neck to sweep large feeding areas without the body needing to move at all. The animal stood still. The neck reached, and as paleontologist Michael Habib found, even the mechanics of neck movement contributed to the animal's survival. The cervical ribs flanking the vertebrae, as they flexed with each motion of the neck, compressed air sacs wrapped around the vertebral artery, acting as an accessory pump that helped drive blood up toward the brain. In Habib's description, the neck paid for itself. The mountain inside was mostly moving air. Now bring all of that together and try to imagine the animal on the floodplain. It is late in the Cretaceous afternoon. The light is warm and long and slightly golden, the kind of light that makes even the tallest conifers look soft. A group of titanosaurs is moving, if moving is the right word for something that covers ground at 7 kilometers per hour and requires planning rather than urgency to change direction through the open landscape near the river margin. Their footsteps leave deep, broad impressions in the wet soil, each one the circumference of a small table spaced several meters apart, filling slowly with dark water as the ground yields and releases. The adults in the group have nothing to fear from predators. Researchers note that the adult body size of the largest titanosaurs made them near impervious to predation. No theropod, however large, posed a reliable threat to a fully grown Argentinosaurus. Even Mapusaurus, the giant predatory theropod known to have lived alongside Argentinosaurus and found in groups of at least 7 individuals, raising the possibility of coordinated group hunting would have been taking an enormous risk in attacking a healthy adult. The giant sauropods moved through their world in a very real sense without significant threat. And that safety, unearned and enormous, expresses itself in everything about their bearing. There is no hurry. There is no watchfulness. The neck sweeps in its long, unhurried arc through the canopy, the small head at the end of 9 meters of hollow, air-filled bone, pausing at intervals to strip leaves and needles from the vegetation with its peg-like teeth. Teeth designed only for harvesting, not for grinding, because the sauropod's digestive system handled the breakdown downstream. The jaw closes, the neck moves on, and the whole motion takes as long as it takes. It is not graceful in the way a dancer is graceful, all precision and effort. It is graceful the way a river is graceful, because it is simply following its own nature at the pace its size demands. Through a landscape, it fills completely. The body itself, when still, which must have been its most common state. An animal that burns this much energy by existing must rest often, must stand and allow the enormous digestive system to process what the neck has gathered, is almost geographic. It occupies space the way a hill occupies space, as a fixed, stable feature of the environment, something other creatures navigate around and build their sense of the landscape relative to. The smaller dinosaurs sharing the floodplain would have known these shapes as landmarks as much as animals. Their stillness was of that quality, and the sound of it. A footstep of 70 tons on soft ground does not clatter or crash. It arrives as a low resonant compression that moves outward through the soil in a slow wave, not violent, closer to the way a ship's displacement moves water. A deep, patient alteration of the space around it, felt before it is heard, registering in the body as much as in the ear. The mountain moves and the earth receives it, and the sound is less a sound than a presence. That quality, weight met by stillness, mass received by earth, something enormous and unhurried moving through a world that makes room for it, is one of the most restful things I can imagine. You have weight tonight, too. The kind that accumulates across a full day of effort and attention and being present for all the things that needed you. The accumulated weight of the day, of everything the hours required of you. And underneath you, right now, something is receiving it. The mattress, the floor, the earth below it, all of it bearing your weight as the floodplain bore those titanosaur footsteps, without protest, without effort, simply receiving. You don't have to hold yourself up anymore. You haven't needed to for some time, but now you can really feel it. Let the weight go down. Let the stillness come up to meet it. Let the hollow, patient, moving air of the night fill whatever space your breathing clears. You are as still as a mountain, and the night is long and warm and entirely yours. Sleep well. If this story settled something in you tonight, if the weight of it felt like rest rather than pressure, I would love for you to press the like button below. It is a small gesture, but it helps Pillow Trace find its way to others who are searching for somewhere large and quiet to rest at the end of a long day. And if you would like another story waiting for you next time, please do subscribe. We will always be here in the slow, warm dark with something worth settling into. Good night.